Welcome to the Moose Lake Nutrient Budget. My name is Kelly Nichaporic, and I'm the chair of the Moose Lake Watershed Society, which is a watershed stewardship group. It was founded in 2002 as the Moose Lake Water for Life Committee and became a society in 2008. This group was formed to address the health of Moose Lake, increase public knowledge and interest, and improve water quality as well as fish and wildlife habitat. This group is made up of volunteers. Some of those volunteers worked really hard this summer to complete extra cyanobacterial monitoring through Alberta Health Services along 3 of our beaches around the lake that included the Moose Lake Provincial Park, Franchier Bay, and Bonnyville Beach. These volunteers committed 5 weeks of their time, at least once a week, going out to collect samples, and for this I'm really thankful, as our volunteers work really hard for our society to complete projects and move forward in understanding our lake and collecting data. What we do in the watershed has compounding impacts on the health of our lakes and rivers. This was the second year that the Moose Lake Watershed Society partnered with Leica Environmental Stewards for the Keep Our Lake Blue campaign. This campaign encourages people to take action to reduce runoff and pollutants, such as phosphorus, from entering the lake. It consists of residents to commit to at least taking one action from a list of possible 52 actions to help reduce all that phosphorus from driving our lake to becoming more green. This year, with funding from the Land Stewardship Centre and Alberta Eco Trust, the focus of programs and projects was the phosphorus reduction. This nutrient budget that you guys will receive a presentation on is a culmination of a multi-year tributary, in-lake, individual basin water quality sampling, as well as the phosphorus flux and core sampling that was completed in 2019. I really hope you enjoy this presentation, and the entire report will be available on the website for you guys to see and get a more in-depth feel of later on. So I really would like to thank Dorda for her hard work on completing the nutrient budget. I do have a huge list of people to also thank. Lakeland Agricultural Research Association for helping with doing the tributary sampling. We've been collecting tributary samples since 2014. As well as the Alberta Lake Management Society, who has done our Lake Watch program for us. They also assisted with our individual basin sampling that is used in the report. The MD of Bonnyville for providing the funds to have the core sampling and the phosphorus fluxination that was done in 2019, done by Dr. Chris Holtz. As well as Alberta Eco Trust for funding the nutrient budget, as well as the Land Stewardship Centre for providing funding for small part of the report, as well as the tributary sampling that we've done, as well as the summer village of Bonnyville Beach. So without everybody's hard work and collaboration on this project, it really wouldn't be possible. I know that Moose Lake is very fortunate to have as much research as we've done. We do have a great understanding, or we're still building that understanding of our lake. And this is just working towards really understanding where we can go from here. I will let Dorda take it away and present what we found through the nutrient budget process.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for the opportunity to work on this project, Kelly. You really made it all happen. So I'll get back to that at the acknowledgement. But yeah, hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Numerous like in great numbers. I'm very happy to see that. I'm going to be presenting on this Moose Lake phosphorus budget project we completed. I guess to myself, an introduction, I'm senior aquatic scientist with Associate Environmental. It's an environmental consultant firm as part of Associate Engineering. And I'm personally in Edmonton, but we worked on this in collaboration with some other folks as well. Like here, Megan, she did actually most of the groundwork, and especially the water budget was just complex to put together, but like everything else. So she's here, my co-author, and possibly she's also on the line. Yeah, and what we do is water quality studies. We are looking at anything that can impact surface waters, including lakes, rivers. So this is one of the funner projects that we do. Very interesting, very, especially in this case, we had a lot of good data. So it was really, really quite, satisfying to work on this project and to be able to present it to you today. So I'm just gonna jump right in. Of course, I might want to share my screen. There we go. Let's give it a moment for everybody. So yep, this is my title slide. So you see already a map here of Moose Lake. It's going to come back. This is actually a sediment core that was taken by John Holtz with Hub Aquatics and Algae Control Canada in 2019 on that Sediment Flux project. We'll talk about it a little later. And often the results of Phosphorus budget are displayed as a pie chart. So I hope you like pie charts because there's going to be a lot of them and we'll go through them one at a time. So let me just see if I can move it forward. Yes. So study questions that we answered in, or tried to answer in this study, where does the phosphorus come from that promotes algae growth in Moose Lake? We know there's algae blooms quite regularly. We can see here on that satellite image a bloom in Bonneville Bay, Bonneville Beach Bay. And one of the bigger question here is, yeah, what are the watershed loads versus in lake sources? Because we've done a lot of work, Moose Lake Watershed Society and partners. A lot of work has been done in looking at the watershed, but the in lake sources is really something that's still unknown in this lake, and it's generally also a science that is still evolving and relatively recent. So that was really the big gap we were trying to address. And then another thing here in Moose Lake that adds to the complexity of the lake is, as you can see, we have all these different bays. So we have Frontier Bay, Bonneville Bay, Bonneville Beach Bay, Viseau Bay, and Island Bay. We'll come back to that. And it's just a very complex basin. And we were also wondering if we can maybe differentiate between these bays in terms of what the importance is of the different sources of nutrients for them. And then, of course, what's coming out of this, well, how do we use all this information in the future to address nutrient inputs? How can this help us to manage and reduce nutrient inputs to the lake to hopefully better reduce algae growth and algae blooms? So what is the phosphorus budget? I just wanted to give a brief background because we're going to be talking about budgets all the time. So I thought at tax season, this is maybe a good parallel here. Phosphorus budget is just like a financial budget. It's a balance of what's coming in and it's going out. So for here, in terms of for the money, it's usually your income and then the expenses, and what you have left is your budget, or is your balance that you have in hand. In this case, you want to minimize the expenses and maximize your income. And now with the phosphorus budgets, quite the same thing. We're looking at the sources of phosphorus and the losses of the phosphorus to the lake. But in this case, we are looking at the sources that are the external and internal loads, how we call them. And then the outflows or the losses are the outflows from the lake and also any phosphorus that is retained in the lake in the sediments. So it's really kind of the same principle. In this case, we are having the goal of actually minimizing the inputs and maximizing the outputs. So, but the same principle. Here for Moose Lake, to kind of break that down a little bit further, what all the inputs and outputs are for phosphorus for Moose Lake. In this specific case, so we have the inputs from the watershed, which we call external loads. Part of those is also septic systems that are around the lake and can discharge through the groundwater some nutrients into the lake. We have another input that comes from the atmosphere through precipitation. There's also a little bit of dry deposition, but so there's another pathway there to have phosphorus come in. And then there's another pathway as well, and that's this internal load that has been a big unknown, and that's the release from sediments. So we have, these are kind of the external loads, how we call them, and then the internal load, and then the losses would be any outflows, in this case through the Moose Lake River, which is misspelled here, should be written together, Moose Lake River, and also any withdrawals. So our study period of time, like the data where we had really complete data, was 2017 to 2019. So at that time, Bonneville was still withdrawing water. I know it has changed now, but for our calculations, we needed to take that into account. And then a big loss item is also the as I said, the retention of the sediments. So the organisms that are living in the lake, and also just particles that come in from the watershed, settle to the lake bottom and create these layers of sediment over the years and centuries. So this is kind of an overall schematic of our phosphorus budget. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually got into getting there. Maybe I'm just going to skip back here for a moment. Maybe you might notice already that from the watershed, the external load is really coming in through rivers or runoff. So through water from the atmosphere, mostly it's also coming through precipitation, again, through water, septic systems, and the outflows also through water. So really the phosphorus budget is very much linked to the water cycle and to a water budget. So that's why for getting a really good phosphorus budget, we first have to get a good water budget. So the water budget for in general for a lake is displayed here. We have all the blue items are sources and the red items are losses. I have kind of highlighted here the in solid font and solid lines the items that we have data for in some ways. So they're measured, and then we used all the measured things that we had, and we knew that we had to balance out, like the inputs and outputs, and we calculated as an remaining item than the surface water inflows. So we have here the precipitation. Again, we have the withdrawals of water. We have a big item as well, a loss is evaporation. I added sublimation because winters are long, and this is the kind of loss of snow into the air during winter. And then we have also the outflow, of course. We do have the groundwater inflows and outflows. I put question marks on here because we don't really know them. So in our approach, we included them in our surface water inflow term because it was an unknown, and that's the piece that we estimated in our water balance. So that was kind of our approach, and the results here for the water budget. You see here in megaliters per year, anything that's positive here from 0 up are the inputs, anything that we're gaining, and then anything that's negative would be the losses. So we have the largest loss through the Moose Lake River. Outflow, quite a bit of loss through evaporation as well, some to sublimation. And then the largest water inflow is really through Thin Lake River. The second are the other tributaries and direct runoff from the watershed. And we have precipitation that's directly on the lake. So and by quantifying these items, this gave us a really good basis then also to calculate the phosphorus inputs, because we have different ways of estimating how much phosphorus in each of these items. So I'll get to that pretty soon. So I'm going to talk about the phosphorus sources now. So we'll talk about the external sources first and then the internal sources. External phosphorus sources come from a variety. I mentioned that we have watershed inputs. So that would include from forest and agriculture. These are the things that we quantified from the watershed. We did quantify from the atmosphere as well, the phosphorus input through precipitation. And we did look at residential inputs here from septic systems. We did not quantify waterfall input. That is an item as well, but it's usually, it can be a very large proportion in smaller urban lakes. Like we have here right in Edmonton, like Havel Lake, Park Lake. There's a lot of waterfall there, and it's really small lakes. So it can become like relatively spoken more important. For Moose Lake, I think it is too big to have a huge impact, but it can be also something that that can be looked at. Next one. So our approaches here for watershed were mainly based on the stream water quality sampling that Kelly talked about. So we had really good concentration data from the streams that are flowing in the watershed. We did use this water quality data then to, and together with the monthly flows that we had estimated from a water budget from 2017 to 2019 to come up with the total. So this is pretty much we aligned with concentration data, and where we didn't have points, we interpolated between the points, and we were aligned with monthly flow numbers. So it was very close to being, we call it like a flow weighted estimate, so that we can break it down like in smaller time steps, which makes it more precise. Septic systems, we used literature estimates for like a per capita kind of phosphorus number that would be coming out of septic systems like all the way at the end when it actually goes into salts and into a groundwater, multiplied by population numbers. And then the atmosphere, we had some numbers from, I think it was Wabamun Lake phosphorus budget, with phosphorus concentrations and precipitation, which is kind of multiplied with the precipitation numbers we had. So we here have the sampling sites for the creek sampling. You see we have some major inflows directly into the lake, which is Weir Creek on the top right into the Zoe Bay. Then we have Wood Creek on the bottom to Bonnyville Beach Bay. We did not have any inflows to Island Lake, Island Bay, sorry. We had data for Finn Lake River at Frontier Bay, like right at the inflow. And then also a couple points in the larger watershed, because the Finn Lake River watershed, as you can see, is really the largest watershed. So we broke it down into a couple more places, especially Yelling Creek, and then another location. And we also had data from the outflow, which is really important to quantify the losses of phosphorus from the lake through the outflow, because we saw like most of the water that Moose Lake is losing is actually going through the outflow. That's a huge loss item, phosphorus. So we really need that to be able to calculate our balance. So really good data. We don't have good data like this for many lakes in Alberta. So this is really fun to work with this data set. Some results here from the stream sampling. This is a flow weighted mean phosphorus concentration in these tributaries that go directly to the lake. And what you can see is there's huge differences. So we had very high concentrations in Yelling Creek. If you remember, I'm going to just go back. It's the one that's actually in the Thin Lake River watershed here upstream. So when you look at the land use, this map is a land use map. It's pretty much all agriculture. And then I'm going to go forward. And then we have also Wood Creek, which had really high phosphorus concentrations, which goes directly into Bonnyville Beach Bay. And then Thin Lake River, actually, although Yelling Creek goes into Thin Lake River, apparently there's lots of water that is actually of better quality, because the concentration when it gets into the lake is much lower. And the Weir Creek in this case had also good water quality here, going into the Zoe Bay. That was not the case the last time sampling was done, so not sure where the difference is. Maybe there's some improvements made. It's unknown at this time. There's also been Bonnyville and that watershed in parts of it, and there's a lot of agriculture as well. But really, in general, the land use there's a lot of agricultural land use. The only sub-watershed I would say it has more forest is in the upper watersheds of Thin Lake River, like Keehaven Lake watershed. So yeah, so we know that there's more phosphorus in the Yelling Creek and the Wood Creek watersheds. Now, after doing all the calculations that I talked about, we came up with this phosphorus budget. Here we see that the inflow through Thin Lake River accounts for about 3/4 of the external inputs of a phosphorus to the lake. So that's a huge amount. It has to do with the water inputs as well. If you remember the water budget, the Thin Lake River had also brought in about 3/4 of the water. So it has to do a lot with the quantity of water coming in. And then other tributaries and runoff contribute about a quarter, and then a little bit of precipitation and septic here on an annual basis for the whole lake. This is a little comparison I thought it was interesting because, as I said, the phosphorus budget is so dependent on the water budget. So how much water gets into the lake does have quite a bit of an influence on how much phosphorus we're also loading to the lake. We have compared our estimates with previous estimates that we found on the literature. So the CPP here, Charette Pelpusante, we did a nutrient loading study earlier based on data from 2005 and 2007, which was right in the middle or actually after quite a longer dry period. So I just displayed here the precipitation that fell in the previous 10 years, so up to 2019. Here in this case, it's over 460 millimeters per year, leading up to 10 years to 2007, it's 427. And in the 80s, we have another literature value. You see here, it's kind of drops to almost half, and then almost a third. We have 405. So the precipitation really plays a huge role in terms of the phosphorus loads. But we also have to remember that it puts also more water in the lake and dilutes it as well. So it's a little complicated to think about this in terms of concentrations. But when we look at the total phosphorus budget, what is important is that it'll drop the external load significantly if it's drier. And that becomes important when we compare external and internal, because the relative importance of internal loads becomes more important when it's drier. So I get back to that again, but I thought it was really interesting how hugely variable this is. And that when we produce one number, we have to put it in context of the variation in the weather and climate we have. So now to the internal source of phosphorus. A little bit of an overview how phosphorus can get from the sediment into the lake. There's a bunch of different ways this can happen, and really it's really difficult to quantify because to go down in the lake and to measure these things is really, really hard. So most of these estimates have been done through laboratory and like mass balance approaches, which I describe a little later. But the various mechanisms are sediment resuspension. So when there's waves or created by wind or boats, we can like the sediment can be just resuspended, and then the phosphorus-rich pore water also gets bit back into a water column. We have some algae that actually grow on the sediment and can take some phosphorus out of that pore water and then kind of transfer it into a water column. Then we have bioturburation, which is a fancy word for like animals just digging around and stirring up sediments. So it's another way of getting phosphorus back into the water column. And then the one on the top panel is, I call it sediment release. It is really a large number of mechanisms which can be physical, chemical, biological, by which phosphorus is simply released, like without any physical perturbation, released into a water column. And so that's the one that we think is the most important in most lakes. And that's the one that we understand the best and we can quantify the best. So there's a lot of things that help with that. When it's warm, like there's, for example, decomposition of sediments. There's some processes that have to do with oxygen. So if you have less oxygen on the bottom, there's more phosphorus release. So there's a number of different processes, but we all kind of wrap it up in this sediment release kind of term. So how do we estimate this if we can't really measure it in the lake? We used 3 different approaches. Like these are the kind of the 3 main approaches that are available. We are lucky enough to have all the data to be able to do that. The first one, the mass balance, is to quantify all the inputs and outputs into the lake and from the lake, plus also quantifying the mass change, which means having really good concentration data in the lake. And then we can kind of reorganize this equation and calculate the sediment flux. Now, in this case, the sediment flux includes what's coming out of in sediment and what's going back into the sediments, kind of a net, we call it a net estimate. But what we're really interested in is actually the gross estimate, because any external loads are also gross estimates. It's just what's coming in, and they're also being lost to sedimentation. So we added another term here of sedimentation to then separate out from the sediment flux what's sedimentation and what's actually coming in from the sediment through release, to really know how this compares to the gross external load, if it's making sense. You can all ask questions later if something is not clear. The second approach is it's called anaxic factor by Gertrude Nürnberg. She has published a lot of papers and done a lot of work on a lot of lakes, produced a lot of empirical data and equations. So there's some good approaches just using unsediment phosphorus data to evaluate how much phosphorus is coming out from sediments. And then one is release experiments. And this is something that was done in 2019 by Algae Control Canada and Harp Aquatics, who went there. Well, I actually don't have that picture right now, but sediment cores were collected from all of the major bays that were accessible by boat, so Franchir Bay, Bonneville Bay, Bonneville Beach Bay, and Biseau Bay, and they were incubated in the lab, and it was like how much phosphorus would be coming out and be released into the water that's just on top of the core was measured to calculate like a rate of phosphorus release. So we had those data as well, which is really quite fortunate, because that can really give us, because all of these estimates are ambient estimates, had to be inferred from other things. So there's always large uncertainties related to it. So having 3 different independent estimates here was really quite fortunate. So these are the results. We did break our results down by the whole lake and also by the 4 main bays. I don't want to go into detail of all the numbers. In general, what we did find is we were all in the same order of magnitude, which is already good. We did have some higher numbers from the Nuremberg approach, which, because it's a literature-based approach, is maybe a little bit less reliable, might be a little bit of an overestimate, not sure. But we do have both the sediment release study, which was using the sediments from the lake, and then the mass balance with all these data that we had from the lake itself. And these both estimates really resulted in 2 very similar lake-wide internal load estimates. So that was really very ensuring. So we ended up using an average of these 2 in our total phosphorus budget. The bay-based budgets, they have more uncertainties associated with them for a number of reasons. One big one is that we didn't account for water exchange between bays, and there certainly is water exchange, there has to be, but we just don't have any way to quantify that. And also some of the concentration data, this was just 1 year, so I have to run this through the 2020 data that we just recently available. But in the end, they're not too far off in terms of order of magnitude. So we just used averages for all of these and then put them into our total budget, total balances, checks and balances of inputs and outputs. And that's what we're gonna get into now. So this is the annual phosphorus budget for Moose Lake. We have here at 57% Thin Lake River. Then we have the remaining tributaries and runoff, almost 20%. We do have internal loads, also 20%. And on the annual basis and for whole lake basis, from precipitation or atmosphere is 3% and septic systems 1%. Now we have to remember, yeah, this is for whole lake, this is for whole year. And we can really see that what's coming into a Thin Lake River is quite dominating. Now I not sure if I have a map. The next one. Wait, going the wrong way. No, okay. One more. So this is the same information that we just saw is all the inputs. So we just saw this broken down into pie chart, but this figure also shows us the losses. So this is the estimated outflow, like the loss of phosphorus through the outflow, and then the loss through sedimentation, based on our estimates. So we can see that the lake retains a lot of phosphorus in the sediments over the years, and since the sediments accumulate, some of the sediment over time becomes unavailable. It is kind of gone and forever kind of in an archive, which is what we can find in the sediment cores. But some of it, about the top 10 centimeters or so, are still available for this release from sediments from time to time, which is coming in for internal loads. Okay, I'll just move on because I wanted to talk about the base a little bit more. So we did break down the phosphorus inputs by bay. Now, what we assumed in this case, so these red lines are really completely artificial. So we just kind of drew those for our analysis purposes. We completely, based on our, just to facilitate our analysis. So that's why the bay budget is, of course, more uncertain. So these numbers here, you can't just say this 39%. That's the number. So we have some, error bars around these, but the results still give us a really good indication of how these bays may differ. And the huge difference is really in Frenchia Bay. So if you see here, Thin Lake River comes in right here to Frenchia Bay, and the outflow of the lake, Moose Lake River, goes right out here. So in our bay budget, we assumed it goes in and it goes out, and there's no exchange. Of course, it's wrong. There's for sure in spring, especially when there's lots of water coming in, there will be water going probably everywhere from Thin Lake River. Some of the bays, when the lake levels are going down, we will lose water, it will go out here. So it's a rough assumption. It's the only one that could work because we don't have any other data, right? So with these assumptions, we found that actually the percentage of internal load goes up quite a bit for the different bays, because that huge external load is not accounted for. And so on an annual basis, that goes up to 40-50% for the different bays here that are more isolated. And when a period that is most of interest to us, because really why we are all here and why we're doing this is the algae, right? We want to know why the algae are growing, where the phosphorus is coming from that the algae feed on. So that is why we also try to do some specific seasonal estimates here in summer. So we looked at, in this case, we looked at for phosphorus concentration increases in these bays as our mass balance, as our change in phosphorus in the lake. And then together with a monthly water budget, which during this time of the year would always go down. So this time of the year, the lake levels would drop. We kind of calculated internal load. And we did that, we actually found that the internal load became even more important. It was 60% here for these two bays, 70 for Island Bay. Island Bay is a little different, it's a little shallower, and there's not as much data available. So we're not as confident in these data, but the Viso Bay and Bonneville Beach Bay data are quite, we have quite a bit of confidence in those. So it was really an interesting result, just to know how much importance the internal loads can have on a seasonal basis in these bays. I'm going to go back one more actually here. I forgot to point out one thing, because we see the septic contribution here is quite low in general, but when we look at the bay budget, annual budget, we do still see 4% and 3%. In the big scheme, that sounds really little, but we also know that we calculated this based on a certain assumption of retention in soils and well-functioning septic systems, which means if things happen like Kelly told me that the lake is flooding and the septic systems are flooding, so there's a shortcut there. If any systems are not functioning properly, this number can, increase quite a bit, because then we would have, pretty much untreated sewage phosphorus, which would be much higher. So we can have, if things are not well maintained, or if we have these events, if it's not pump out systems, these numbers can actually go up quite a bit as well. So it's important to remember. Okay, I think that's for results. Enough pie charts for today. What's the takeaway? So some of the key results here I want to highlight and reiterate is that we, in those tributary sampling, we found that the highest phosphorus concentrations were in Yelling and Wood Creek. We found that Finn Lake River carries most of the water and phosphorus from the watershed into the lake, but concentrations are at the lake are low. So really the most impact, I guess, direct impact of high concentrations would be from Wood Creek. Again, it doesn't have a lot of flow, but there's like this buffering capacity here of Finn Lake River still to help with the Yelling Creek concentrations. The internal load is significant. We found that up to 60% for some of the base comes from internal load during the summer, during the period when the algae actually grow, right? They usually kind of start growing in May, and then June there's kind of an increase, and usually you see the blooms happening in July, August, right? And this is exactly the period we analyzed. And we found that it was about 60%. Now, an interesting point is I showed you all these external load numbers from different years. They can drop, like if we get back into a drier period, these external loads can drop by half or even more, right? And based on these other studies that you've seen. So when that happens, the internal loads are going to stay the same. They're always there, and even if it's drier and if it's also sunnier, warmer, it might actually become a more important process. So this can rapidly even go higher. And yeah, the septic estimates very low, but again, these are assuming proper function. So if we want to really make sure that these contributions are low, we have to make sure that both are all functioning properly, or pumping systems, pump out systems. Otherwise, we could actually, in the end, and the big scheme, also contribute. Every little thing helps. I like that 51 actions that you talked about, Kelly. That's one of them for sure. So what are implications for lake management? What does this all mean? So it makes sense that the creeks that we've seen that had the highest concentrations in phosphorus are probably good candidates for watershed management. Yelling Creek and Wood Creek watersheds. There's many things that can be done. We already chatted, and I know around Moose Lake, a lot of things have been done. Riparian assessments. Riparian health is really important because that's what's filtering the nutrients. But also, of course, the source control, right? How is the manure managed, or how are feedlots managed? What is going on with fertilizers? There's a lot of things, lots of best management practice that can be implemented. And since the internal load is so important, I think it will be still useful to assess the feasibility of in-lake management. There's a bunch of options. One that I put in here, sediment inactivation, because it's one of the most common ones. It has shown success in the States and other jurisdictions around the world. Of course, you have to look at the size of a lake. It's a big lake, and it would be likely very good to look at individual bays, where we have more more chance of success. And maybe it would be good to look into to then also look a little bit into what the phosphorus budget would be. So if you're taking out, if you're calculating, you're taking a certain amount of phosphorus out from sediments, how much is going to be left, like what's going to be the outcome. So there's like a whole set of things that need to be done to before we're gonna go this way. Is that septic systems? They're a small piece, but they're still important. And something I haven't mentioned yet, but just because we know that the phosphorus budget is so closely tied to a water budget, we learned that there's plans to remove the weir that is downstream of the lake. That's in Moose Lake River. And yeah, we think it would be, and there's a study that said it wouldn't have a big influence on the lake levels, so which is great, but I think it would still be useful to analyze what impact that would have on the water budget and phosphorus budget on the lake and water quality in Moose Lake, because that would change things for sure. A little thing here at the end, how we could still improve the phosphorus budget. Of course, a budget or a model is always only as good as the data that go into it. So the tributary sampling and the individual base sampling in Moose Lake is really important. So it'd be really useful to keep doing them and improve our estimates here with the different years of different precipitation. We did have a big gap in data and water quality that's coming in from a watershed. And we believe that Thin Lake River is actually carrying water into a lake during winter. So it'd be great to sample that. And I kind of skipped over the groundwater in our estimation. I said it was in our external load estimates. So some previous estimates say it is a net input, but it would be good to look into that also a little bit further, just maybe to tease it out a little bit more. It doesn't affect our conclusions in terms of a percentage of internal load, but it does the external load. So it could be an interesting thing to pursue. Yeah, and I want to take the time to again thank Kelly, who pulled all the strings and made this happen together with the Moose Lake Watershed Society and the Lakeland Agricultural Users Association. I mentioned Ray from Algae Control Canada and John from Hub Aquatics, who did the sediment work, and lots of funding sources here about EcoTrust, Land Stewardship Center, Summer Village, Bonneville Beach, MD of Bonneville. And then we got quite a bit of help with the data from Alberta Lake Management Society, Alberta Environment Parks, Town of Bonneville. So big collaborative effort. So thanks everybody. It was really great to be working on this. And yeah, I'll be happy to take out your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I greatly appreciated having you present the data that we've worked so hard for. I'm just going to read out the questions that are in the chat, and hopefully we can get along answering. So as people have questions, just feel free to put them in the question and answer section. So the first question is from Ray Makaweki. If the lake water level was lower and Moose Lake surface area was reduced, would you expect increased frequency of algal blooms and poorer water quality with the higher phosphorus concentrations mentioned in the presentation?
That's a good question. I'm a very analytical person, so I always tell you I have to do the calculations first. But off the top of my head, there's two things that was like main things that lower water level will do. One is it will increase the water temperature because you get more sunlight. It will also create more mixing, so it might increase the rate by which we get internal loads from the sediments. On the other hand, we will have less volume, so the water will flush through faster. So we will get reduce the time that the water stays in the lake. But I'm not sure if that's going to be enough to, balance the internal load. So my best guess would be we're risking having more phosphorus in the lake. But yeah, I'd love to run that scenario through our model to see if it's true. But yeah, that's my answer for now.
Okay, the next question is, how does someone join the Moose Lake Watershed Society? That's a good question. You can get a hold of me at 780-812-1036, either through Lakeland Agricultural Research Association is probably the easiest way. So You can also respond to the email when you registered for the Zoom webinar. The next question is it fair to say that the amount of sediment phosphorus is increasing faster over the last 10 years? Do the overall phosphorus that's coming in from the offending creek, oops, it's not quite, so is the phosphorus increasing over the last 10 years due to the overall phosphorus that's coming in from the creeks?
I don't know that. We didn't look into the sediment phosphorus. It's a tricky thing to do as well, because phosphorus and sediments does have a tendency to move. So even if you have certain phosphorus levels in the sediment, it has a tendency to kind of migrate back towards the top. So we often have a lot of phosphorus in the top anyways, which can be mistaken for getting more phosphorus from a watershed. I mean, what could be done is calculating like a trend, I guess, over time, how much phosphorus has been coming in, because I think the data might be there for a longer period of time. But yeah, I don't know if John Holt's on the line and could answer the question, but yeah, it's one thing that I just know from the literature, like I've looked into this a little bit, and there was a really interesting study somewhere that kind of sampled phosphorus like in sediments like all over a lake, and it was like a bigger lake, and then there's one area of the lake had a forested watershed, and one had like an agricultural watershed, and the sediments near the agricultural watershed definitely had more phosphorus and also more releasable phosphorus, which is the portion that gets your internal load, right? So from that literature knowledge, I would say yes, probably, because we've been modifying the landscape so much in the last 50 years, but over the last 10 years, I don't know, just because we had more rain, I'm not sure if the quantity of phosphorus would have been more. It's possible. I would have to think of that. John, do you have an answer? I think Kelly is able to unmute you if you want. No? Okay. But I would be happy to have a discussion, like just to know where you are coming from with the 10 years, and then maybe we could talk about that a bit more.
Okay, the next question is, could sediment cores be used to evaluate whether there have been any changes in phosphorus input or fertility over the years? This would give a pre-settlement picture.
Yes, and it has actually been done, and I actually was involved with that study. Those cores were taken, however, quite a while ago now. Sad, it makes me feel old, but that was 2005 or 6. We took a sediment course, and in Moose Lake we actually took a bunch. We took one in Wizzo Bay, one in Bonneville Beach Bay, and they analyzed along with a few other lakes in the area. And there's a report out there. It's online. Like that can be forwarded. So we did analyze that. We did find that that Moose Lake has always been eutrophic, which means it's always had a lot of algae. We did find that that we had some increases, like we had some species that are like more indicative of more nutrients. In Wizzo Bay, we found that was well resolved. We had some problems, and I think Bonneville Beach Bay, we had a lot of preservation issues, so we couldn't really draw really good conclusions. So we could definitely see some changes. We were not as, I guess, drastic as you would have thought. What would probably be interesting is to redo this, because we had 2020 and those courses were taken 15 years ago. But we do have a baseline, and we know it's always been somewhat nutrient rich. So now if the next question that's coming, well, how much of that phosphorus budget now it's natural and how much is human? I can't tell you that. Because really we always have phosphorus coming in. It's a natural thing, right? It's a necessary element for the algae to live, and it's always a big question. It can be probably modeled. It's something we can do, but exactly say how much we had. And another thing also that we can actually do is apply a phosphorus reconstruction model, like to these data we get from the sediment cores. So what we analyzed were diatoms. At the time, we didn't really have a good model. I do remember we tried to apply the models to reconstruct phosphorus concentrations, but yeah, we weren't very successful at the time. So that's kind of a gap as well. We currently don't really have a really good model for reconstructing phosphorus in Alberta lakes, but it can be done.
Okay, so what methods can be used to mitigate the internal load from the sediment?
So there's a large number of options in theory. I'm just preparing this presentation here for another for the Bish. Really, what it comes down to, the most common applications and the most successful applications have been sediment inactivation and to a certain extent also aeration. So those are the two main methods. Sediment inactivation is putting a certain substance on top of the sediments, either alum or phostox, another one is different. It has been done using calcium as well in the 80s, but wasn't that successful in Alberta. And it prevents this chemical and exchange or physical exchange between the two layers, right? The water and the sediments. Aeration gets to the oxygen. I mentioned that internal release is much stronger and much faster when you have little oxygen in the bottom waters. So aeration can deal with that, well oxygenate the phosphorus and keep it in the sediments. Yeah, those are a couple ones where a bunch of, well, if you're looking at the internal load management, those are probably the main ones. Yeah.
Okay.
The other ones, I was thinking about all these mechanisms, but there's other things that people have proposed to deal with algae directly, right? So there's other mechanisms, but to get to the internal load, those are the main ones.
So what impact do you think that gray water discharge would have on the budget?
I'm actually curious about that. I didn't have enough time since we talked to compare phosphorus numbers between actually the raw sewage, if it would go in directly, right? If there was this accidental flooding or something, right? So it's quite high. So you would, if it's consistently, around the lake, like if let's say everybody's getting flooded and everybody, it's not being treated and it's just going in the lake, like the numbers we presented might be 10 times that. Like I don't want to put too much like on this number, but it's definitely going to be higher. So there's a reason why we have treatment systems. There's reasons why we treat usually like municipal wastewater and wastewater treatment plants, and there's quite a bit of removal of organic compounds. Like not even mentioning the bacteria and everything. I mean, that's really bad as well, right? But if you're just thinking about phosphorus, usually septic systems work with the soil and the soil can absorb the phosphorus. So if it's not happening, it would be multiplied by a certain number. I don't know what it is. I would have to look at that again as well. Yeah.
Based on the internal loading data, would a hypolunetic withdrawal system similar to what was done in Pine Lake in southern Alberta be effective at reducing phosphorus?
In Moose Lake, I don't think so, for the reason that, and I didn't go into this, Bonneville Beach Bay, which is the largest bay, and also Frontier Bay are polymictic, what we call it. So these are mixing quite often in the year. So they don't form this low, like this separate layer of water that has little oxygen in it. We call it a kind of an anoxic layer on the bottom of a lake on a regular basis. So you wouldn't be able to take it out there. You could, in theory, you could probably try it in Viso Bay. In Viso Bay is deep, and you do have of a stratification with the anoxic layer on the bottom. However, it is still quite a large area. So, and the problem is, if you pull that water out, well, the water will, come back in from the other base, just kind of move back in, which might also have a lot of phosphorus in it. So I'm not quite sure. It was something that would need to be looked at, right? That's the limitation here. We focus our efforts on quantifying phosphorus. So now, if you get to the solutions, like usually you want to have a look at, like, to actually have an evaluation of the options and a little bit of a quantification at the end, saying, well, if I do this, how much phosphorus do I remove, and also what are the implications, right? For example, in Pine Lake, it was easy because it was like one simple basin, you have one inflow, one outflow, so we would just, take some of the water from the deeper areas and release it downstream into the next stream. Now, Viso Bay doesn't have an outflow, so where do you put the water, right? You would put it all the way to Moose Lake River. It's quite a it's quite a project, and I'm not sure if it would be working. Would be interesting to look at, but the thing is, there's always going to be more phosphorus releasing as well. So I'm not sure how successful that would be. Good question, Rob.
So will removing the weir in the Moose Lake Creek or Moose Lake River create a positive impact to Moose Lake? You did say that it would impact the phosphorus levels, but you did not say if it would be positive or negative.
Yeah, so it's something we didn't assess, right? We didn't look at. So from what I remember in that report that looked at the water or the Weir option, we said if you keep all the beaver dams on the Moose Lake River, and if you keep all the reed beds and all the aquatic plants, the level would only go down by 25 centimeters. So it's within the annual lake variations. So it might be just fine. It might actually not change much at all. But if it's going down more, I think it should be assessed. My gut feeling tells me it's not going to be good, but yeah, I'm not going to put my signature on it yet.
Okay, from this study, what would be the most practical steps that would help reduce our algal blooms?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? In the end, you look at the phosphates budget, and there's always different items, right? They are all important. So ideally, you want to do well in all of them. I guess the biggest change you could be making at this point is probably the internal load, because that hasn't been addressed at all, right? I mean, the Watershed people have been working on that, like the Watershed, there's the Watershed, State of Watershed, and there has been a lot of activities, so those should continue. But it is a big watershed, so when you do like something in different places, it always takes a lot of time. It's not something that you're going to see right away, right? It's something you need to do, because for the long term, you need to keep that watershed load lower, to make sure, even if you do anything also in the lake, that it's actually going to be successful in the long run. So yeah, I guess maybe the most immediate impact would be to attack the internal load, but again, that needs to be assessed. It can be, we have to assess the cost and the impacts. It's not something that has been done a lot in Alberta, and not in natural lakes anyways. So there's a process. So it's not going to be quick on that end. It's going to be taking a lot of time to put things into place. Need the regulatory approvals. Everybody needs to be on board, and it needs to be done well and researched well. So there's no easy, quick solution for sure. But yeah, we can move forward anyways on several fronts. I would still think.
Somebody had spoken with Alberta Environment last spring and summer. The young gentleman he spoke to mentioned that the contract to remove the weir was awarded last summer and the construction demolition will take place this spring and summer. Is that true? Not to my knowledge, but you'd have to talk to the MD of Bonnyville, I think, about that.
It'd be good to know. Yeah, so, I don't know.
It's been very not been talked about too much, or talk to your MLA. They'd have the best answer. Caitlin from the MD does say that it is true. So yes. This might also be one for Caitlin to answer. Does the MD of Bonnyville do they do any monitoring of septic tanks fields around the lake? I can probably just get Caitlin to answer that directly. If she'd like to unmute herself.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess this is a yes and no kind of question and answer. The MD does not have a monitoring program at this time, but under the Alberta safety codes and there is requirements for systems to be checked if they're suspected of failing or need replacement. So there is some stuff that can be done, but I guess as a whole lake, no, not unless there's complaints about or suspicion about a damaged or non-working septic field at this time.
There's a question about Pine Lake was also considered to have a significant increase in P input post-settlement. I'm not entirely sure, there's no question there. But obviously their levels have gone up. So there's another question. Can you deal directly with algae by harvesting it? For example, would it help the problem beyond the short term or not?
That's one of the techniques that's sometimes being proposed. There's no published record of this helping to decrease phosphorus levels in the lake or algae blooms. So it has, like, algae have been harvested for actually using the algae, like for products or for extracting, like for nutrient supplements and things like that. But yeah, we did a big review of data and like all kinds of options. And at the time we did that for Pigeon Lake, like in 2018 or so. We couldn't find any documented record that was actually an effective thing. And I can see how, because algae will just go back, right? There's a lot of nutrients, and if you take them out, there will be more growing. Maybe on a very small basis you can do it, but in a larger lake like this, water is moved around quite a bit. Algae are being moved around. So if you take algae out in one area, we will come back. So I don't think it's going to be very, very effective.
If this budget was based on the data from 2017 to 2019, do you know how much the phosphorus budget varies between those 3 years?
I do. So now I have to pull this up here. Here, look, I had it right open. Can you still see my screen here? I'm just zooming in a little bit. So these are our phosphorus budgets for 3 years. This is just the inputs, and I don't have the internal here. But we definitely had in 2018 the largest inputs from external. We also had the highest concentrations in the lake. It was like 0.9, I think, on average over a year. It was lower on the other 2 years. So there's an indication that it makes a big difference of what's coming in from Watershed. Yeah, so we did make these estimations for the whole lake. We didn't for the individual base because we had the base specific sampling only in 2017. But this is about how it looks like. I didn't plot this with with the internal load, but I might have it somewhere. I don't know. If that's the question, I can pull that out for you. Just gonna get my questions over here again. I saw this a question that you already clicked as answered, the one about the fish. I thought it was a good one, Kelly. If the water level would come down, if it wouldn't also have an effect on the fish populations. I think that's true. You know, you have less, the water levels go down, you have less habitat for sure. And as I said, it's also going to be warmer. So again, fish will like it a little cooler, won't like it. But I'll let you manage the questions. So I don't want to drop. I just saw this one. I wanted to jump on it.
There was a question regarding if the weir is removed and water levels do go down, how does that affect the fish habitat?
Okay. Yeah. So definitely lose some of that room in the deep areas where fish might like to hang out. It's a little cooler, unless there's not little oxygen. And just less room in general, right? So also less connectivity to Island Bay, because that seems to be a nice little refuge there with lots of plants and such.
So is there an achievable solution for Moose Lake? If yes, what will it take? What do we need? Residents to step up, business owners, the town, Bonnyville, the MD of Bonnyville? What do we think?
Well, I'm a born optimist, so I would say yes, there's an achievable solution, but it really takes everybody. So you can't just say these people are now going to all do it, and we'll just support them in that. So we see that there's huge things coming in from Watershed. So there's a lot of continued watershed management needs to be done and collaboration with landowners, and at the same time, yeah, looking at the ending solutions, that has a financial impact. It's definitely something that everybody would need to contribute as well. Definitely need to support all these initiatives. I think even and I think Kelly can speak to that a little bit more. What she thinks can be done better in the watershed, and the weather certainly has played a role too, right? With all the rain, things have just come down from everywhere, but yeah, so it's I think improvements can be done. Very good examples. I think John showed some in his presentation a couple of years back there. So it just takes a very concerted and directed effort. Everybody needs to be on the board.
I will definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Definitely, we need to have a bigger conversation about it, and it's something that we need everybody at the table to be part of. And there are many innovations that have been coming, lots more research that's been done, and it's something that we definitely can work on as a whole community together. There's another question for Caitlin. Is the MD considering increasing fines and enforcement inspections for malfunctioning septic systems?
We are currently looking into our options as far as what we can do with Alberta safety codes and with Alberta Health Services. Right now, we're trying to figure out how we can do that to make sure that it's fair for everybody. We can do proper assessments and figure out the best methods to do it. We've been looking at how other lakes in the province have done it in the last few years. And theirs is very different simply because they also have regional waste collection, whereas we don't currently have that out at Moose Lake. So we are looking into it. We've been looking into it since probably September. And hopefully we'll be able to work with Alberta Health Services here to get some clearer answers moving forward. So that's kind of what we've been doing right now. I hope that kind of answers your question at this time. But we are doing some more work with residents to stop a lot of the dumping and the gray water discharge, and figuring out more based on Alberta safety codes what we can enforce under their guidelines as well. So we've been doing a lot of research into that.
I think also one next step might be to do some septic sampling. I guess it's not. We had talked about the qPCR a long time ago, and there are. I know that Patrick Hannington of the U of A is doing a lot of work with qPCR. It might be something to investigate for this coming summer, to do some sampling to see and get a better grasp on how much septic's actually entering the lake, because that was a really big unknown for the phosphorus budget.
Yeah, so we're looking at that as well with AHS and the safety codes, because when we sample, it's a volunteer base, obviously, who would ever do it. But if their system did find any fault in it, they would automatically have to fix it and go through the required upgrades or whatnot. And we were trying to figure out what the best method is to maybe assist with that. Because once the first volunteer, hypothetically, system would fail, we would be kind of trying to figure out how to make sure that everybody else afterwards wouldn't quit out of the testing program simply because of the bills that may come with a failed system. So we are looking at some funding options to help with that as well.
I see another question here, Kelly, that was asked during my presentation. Someone asked, Kristen asked how the Moose Lake phosphorus budget compares to other lakes. And I can just generally say that it's not that different actually from other lakes that I've seen, other phosphorus budgets I've seen, where internal loads usually are, especially in Alberta, we just have this mix of lots of phosphorus in the sediments and conditions to release a lot of phosphorus back to water columns. So internal load is actually a very important component of phosphorus budgets in many lakes in Alberta. So I wanted to bring that up as well. It's also something that's kind of across the prairies. There was a paper that came out a few years ago that talked about internal loading for Canada lakes, and it said, yeah, the prairie lakes are the ones that have the highest influence. And although Moose Lake is in the Boreal region, it's kind of in the transition. So that's just something we have to live with here in Alberta. I think that's it. I'm sorry to hear that someone couldn't hear me. I also need a reminder to speak up. So I hope you still could hear me and understand me. So I apologize.
So there's two last questions that have just come in. So realistically, if Moose Lake was fertile pre-settlement, it'll go back to being fertile eventually, even if a huge effort and expense went into removing phosphorus, correct?
Well, that's the thing, we're fertile and fertile, right? So really, like, the objective here is not to get a clear blue lake like in Jasper National Park, right? I think the idea is, and that's something that's really important too when you're developing a strategy of phosphorus. We'd call it a phosphorus management strategy. We did that really well for Lake Simcoe in Ontario. The objective wasn't to go back to pre-settlement. They knew it wasn't realistic, and the objective wasn't. So the objective was kind of something that could be achievable, but it would at least achieve a certain goal. And Lake Simcoe was completely different, where the goal was to achieve a certain level of oxygen in the bottom waters so that the lake trout could survive and that the fisheries would be still good. So there's a very specific reason behind it. Here, mostly it's reduce the frequency intensity of algae blooms. So there will always be algae, but if there could be a reduction in the intensity or frequency of them and maybe reduce the health risks right in the beach, that's kind of the goal. So yeah, it's always going to be fertile, but how fertile? So that's kind of a question, I would think.
Okay, and last question is, how much is lawn fertilizer and other chemicals affecting the issue of phosphorus in the lake? What about fertilizer and other agricultural inputs from the agricultural lands that are next to the lake?
Sorry. Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's part of that watershed load, right? The thing is, our data can't distinguish right now, but we do know that some of these higher concentrations we've seen in Yelling Creek and in Wood Creek are representative of intensive agriculture, which goes along with either a lot of livestock or fertilizer use, and that's always part of the watershed equation. So it's definitely something that I know in Pigeonic we've looked at. We've implemented fertilizer bylaw. People can't put fertilizers on their lawns in a certain distance from the lake. Various phosphorus management, fertilizer management practices for agriculture, where based on soil phosphorus content, you can kind of optimize the fertilizer, so you're only putting as much as you need, and nothing is going to run off because it's all going to be taken up. So there's practices to reduce that impact for sure. So it's part of a big equation for sure. How much, again, I can't say because I don't know. I think there's actually some statistics on how much fertilizer has been sold or something in a certain region. There's some interesting census or data sources where you can actually look at how much fertilizer is being used in a certain watershed. We haven't done that, but it's definitely part of the equation. And if it's right at the lake, right, you know it's going to come in there. It's right. It's going right into the lake. Hope it helped.
Okay, well, I want to thank you so much for presenting today, as well as thank you for everybody who attended. It's going to lead to some really good conversations, I think, in the near future as to what we can do to help improve Moose Lake.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It was great. Thanks for all good questions. It would be nicer to do this in person, have conversations afterwards, but we'll do it another time. So yeah, thanks, Kelly.
Okay, thank you.